All right, everyone, I'm going to start us off and just a big hello, welcome, whether it's evening, morning, afternoon, whatever part of the world that you're from. Thanks so much for joining us today. And my name's Sarah Wiley. I'm the Associate Director of Outward Bound International. And I'm really excited to be co-hosting alongside Outward Bound Canada this really important conversation with authors Nevin Harper and Will Dobud,
Good enough.
authors of the best-selling book Kids These Days. What I really liked about this book is it goes beyond asking, what's wrong with kids these days? And I'm sure that we have all said that many times in the last few years. But it asks a more important question, and that's more what has changed in the world surrounding the young people? What's changed in their environment? What's changed in society? And what can we do as the adults in their lives to address this? Nevin and Will are self-professed nonconformists, and in their book and in their research, they challenge a lot of the assumptions shaping the conversation around childhood and adolescent. And they really encourage us to think about what young people really need. And they offer what I think is a much more hopeful perspective around resilience and growth and well-being. And so I'm really grateful for that. This conversation resonates really strongly with the work that we do at Outward Bound across the globe in 35 independent schools on 6 continents. And we've been doing it for 85 years. Like Nevin and Will, Kurt Hahn, who was a co-founder of Outward Bound, was a nonconformist, and he challenged a lot of the assumptions of the day. He was an educator, but he really believed deeply in the capacity for young people to thrive when they were given trust, when they were given responsibility, challenge, and purpose. And at Outward Bound, we see that all the time. We see the positive impact that those kind of challenging, purposeful, adventurous experiences that connect young people to themselves, to others, and to nature, the impact that that has. Nevin and Will bring a combination of research, practice, and lived experience. They're educators, researchers, parents, therapists, and they bring all that to their research, to the conversation. We're really grateful to have them here with us today and to help us to explore how we can start to think differently about how we as the adults can better prepare the young people for the rapidly changing world that we all know is upon us right now. So thanks so much for being here, Will and Nevin. Thanks everyone for joining us, and we really look forward to this discussion.
Awesome. Thank you, Sarah. And it's also really nice to be here. Um, it is 6:30 in the morning in Adelaide. I know all of the European folks are up very late too. And so thanks everyone for joining. It's also, I think, one of the bonuses of technology. And I said this, having a writing partnership with someone like Nevin. I wake up in the morning, I get Nevin for the end of his workday, and then when I go to when I'm done with my workday, the Europeans are waking up. So it's actually really nice to have a global sort of way of working with things. But it's really awesome to be here and to talk about Kids These Days, the book we wrote. But we just wanted to do a quick introduction and also some ways to stay connected if you want to. But Nevin and I connected over 10 years ago now, and we did an edited book called Outdoor Therapies, and we were writing some peer-reviewed research that nobody really reads, but we were having fun. We kind of were kindred spirits in saying what research is actually important to be done to be what's important for the public interest above just like vanity project proving how great everything is and how a lot of research gets done. So Nevin is someone who is there's no researcher will without Nevin. So it's been an amazing adventure writing together. And so there's some outdoor therapy stuff we've written. We'll get back to kids these days and talk a bit about why we did that in a second. I want to share really quickly. I don't know if you could see my mouse, but if you see this Outdoor Therapy Center logo, this was something Nevin was a part of from a distance, but I always like talking about this because Nevin and I really challenged American wilderness therapy practices in our research. And one of the things that became quite a contentious topic with things. My whole adult life has been doing outdoor expedition-based therapeutic work with adolescents. And we saw this model of wilderness therapy that we really wanted to say, this could be really quite harmful and is quite harmful a lot of times. And I caught wind about 5 years ago of American wilderness therapy researchers wanting to distance themselves from wilderness therapy, and they were going to call themselves the Outdoor Therapy Center. And I went, no frickin' way. That's Maya Nevin's book. That can't happen. So I bought outdoortherapycenter.com purely out of spite. I said, we cannot let this happen. But what that website turned into is something really nice. There's no credit card, what we built was with a bunch of people from all over the world, friends from Latvia, Australia, US, Canada, UK, Spain, Czech Republic, is we all tried to build the website that is the best, what the website we would have wanted getting into this field. So there's like 100 something free hours of webinars, expert stuff, podcasts, tons of stuff to engage with if you're interested. I just like plugging that because I think it's a really fun passion project that is about sharing everything, as one of our Norwegian colleagues said to us. But my name is Will. I am a social worker through and through. I work at a university in Australia. I'm from the U.S., from Washington, D.C., and it's really awesome to be here and to share some of these ideas with you all.
Okay, brief introduction. Nevin Harper. I work at the University of Victoria. I'm a professor, research professor there, and currently the director of the school that I work in the Faculty of Health. As Will said, we've worked together in this realm of outdoor therapies. We tried hard in writing this book to not just write another outdoor therapy book, but we will give credit to our field in many ways. We found our conversations with people that we were talking to and researching the book with, that they all seemed to think that the work that we were doing, which is connecting people with nature and taking people out on adventures, trips and so forth, just like Outward Bound, that there's some significant impact, therapeutic potential, capacity for change, growth, development, all those things that we already know and believe in. And so it was reassuring in the way that this book came together that the people that we were interviewing were constantly telling us that we were on the right path. Like the work that you're doing is important. However, Will and I were sitting at a conference, I think 3, maybe even 4 years ago now in Norway, and having conversations about youth and mental health. Areas that the majority of the people, the 500 people that were at that conference, were there to talk about. And we were all sharing the work that we do. And so, as biased as we are that the outdoors is the best place for therapeutic things to happen, we found ourselves having conversations about the current state of affairs of youth. And so, when you start looking at the statistics of how are kids in the States doing, how are kids in Canada doing, how are kids in Australia doing, there's this question like, it seems, at least according to what's being measured, that things are getting worse. So, are we contributing to this? Are we a part of the problem? And so, Will and I both went home, got back busy with our own work, and we talked about a project. We talked about talking to the experts, and this book project started with interviews. I got access to a few folks that I had connected with over the past number of years as a researcher, like Dr. Michael Unger. probably one of the world's foremost youth resiliency researchers at Dalhousie University. And we just talked about his work and the overprotection of kids and what builds resiliency. And he again has a history of supporting outdoor ecotherapy type programs. It's a part of his history too, because he knows that there's power in the work. Um, so that led to, you know, the next person I got access to was Dr. Gordon Neufeld, Canadian parenting guru. For anybody listening that's a parent, you'll know that his book, Hold On to Your Kids, is one that every parent has to read and understand about the difference between peer orientation and adult value formation and so forth. Um, and we heard critiques. So there was, I think, 12 people interviewed for the book, 12 experts in psychology, child development, psychiatry, environmental health, parenting, behavioral medicine, you name it, neurology. We talked to people and we continued to hear their messages and we continued to hear them critiquing what is not working. And sometimes those things that were not working were a bit shocking to us. Dr. Gordon Neufeld, social emotional learning. We're like, what's wrong with social emotional learning? It's a big curricular piece of education these days. His critique was that school systems adopted social emotional learning, and many people on this call may be familiar with what that looks like and what those practices look like. His critique was that the language and the use of social emotional learning curriculum has moved down through the ages into early years. And that's where he says this is completely problematic. We're spending too much time trying to teach kids to regulate their own behavior, regulate their own nervous systems, and it's causing more problems. Kids are learning therapeutic language, they're learning clinical language, they're not able to regulate themselves, and teachers are, in some ways, using social emotional learning as an opportunity to get kids to regulate themselves. Anyways, point is, the beauty in talking to people like that is where you learn that some of the things that adults are doing knowingly and believing that we're doing good sometimes potentially can be causing harm. And that's the nature of the book. That's where it took us 2.5 years to unpack those 12 conversations and look at the literature and understand the research and end up producing a book and saying things that runs against some of the common narratives. Before this webinar started, we were talking about cell phones and smartphones and social media use and what the research is actually saying. And so that's what we invite. We invite people to be curious. In the book, we challenge a lot of beliefs about what we think is working and isn't working. And I think we should get to the book. Well,
Sure.
yeah.
So yeah, when Nevin started this, I sort of was a bit apprehensive because I know that there are too many parenting books. There's way too many books about therapy. And there's also way too many books with 12 rules, 4 norms, 7 habits, 10 steps. And Nevin and I really had this idea of not telling people what to do, but instead keep public interest in mind and let people make their own decisions with things. Um, and so Nevin started all these interviews, and Nevin can attest to this that we really struggled to put too many ideas into one book, which was also kind of like when you think about sort of when we think about philosophy, like there's one way of seeing the world, but there's another way of seeing it. And what we saw in headlines on the news and in the papers and on the internet was this like for instance, we can anyone who scrolls on a website might see an ad that's like, 2 glasses of red wine a day, really good for X cholesterol or something. And then you keep scrolling and it says there's no safe amount of alcohol ever. And you go, how does any adult navigate this world that we have all these conflicting narratives? And so we had all these different ideas, and I took A3 paper, put it all over the wall of my office at home, and I took post-it notes and yarn and tried to tie these things together. And my office looked like I was the Unabomber, as one of my friends said when that happened. But then I thought about one of my favorite nonfiction writers, Dr. Atul Gawande. An amazing book to read is called Better. It's about it's a kind of self-helpy in a way, but it's about a surgeon who's trying to get better at being a surgeon, and how do you do that? And one of his arguments is it takes this idea of positive deviance. And this became sort of the crux and the theme of our book. And positive deviance came from this idea. It came from nutrition research in the 1960s, oddly enough. And the Save the Children Foundation went to Vietnam. They thought about how on earth are we going to solve child malnutrition in Vietnam in the 1960s. So they came with the food pyramid, the one that the bread companies made. And they came and they said, we are here to help you all with malnutrition. And they ran out of money. And these two people that were over there on this project for the Save the Children Foundation, they said, well, instead of wasting our time and boo-hooing about having no money, why don't we find the healthiest kids in the poorest neighborhood and see what they're doing? And they found them. And they found that these families really bucked the mainstream. They deviated from the cultural norm. So they had feeding practices, eating the little shellfish and the rice patties, leaving skin on the sweet potatoes. Um, Most importantly, they fed their kids when their children had diarrhea. They kept them hydrated and fed them. This was not a cultural norm of the time. So, what they did to create this sort of idea of positive deviance is they took the deviants and then got them to teach the sort of status quo what to do. So we think of the people that we interviewed and the people that we talked to as not only deviants who were also at the end of their career and quite brave in what they really talked to us about. But I love this quote from Sarah Parkin, and Sarah Parkin writes this quote about environmental sustainability. And so she writes that positive deviance means doing the right thing despite being surrounded by the wrong institutional structures, the wrong processes, and working for a university, stubbornly uncooperative people. That is what leadership means today. Surrounded by the evidence, it's not possible to say I did not know. So this became sort of a guide for Nevin and I that it's kind of like if we surround people with the evidence, then we can start asking different questions, asking unscripted questions about youth mental health. We can count something. We can do a good inquiry into what we really think is going on. And that way we can share our ideas. All of you in this room have something to share, and to share that widely helps to change the narrative about what's going on. It helps to lead to some sort of change in by deviating from what's not working in a really positive way. So as much as Sarah said, Nevin and I are sort of nonconformists, at the same time, we're not burn down everything people. Let's deviate in a positive direction and do the work to make sure that that deviation is heading for a positive outcome. I will pass back to you, Captain Nevin.
Okay. Um, I have some familiarity with Outward Bound, of course. I have worked with the Research Advisory Committee for, I don't know, 15, 16 years now, both with Outward Bound Canada, Outward Bound International. I was actually the director of Outward Bound out here in British Columbia for a year in, I don't know which year it was, but it was about 15 years ago. I think it was 2010. So understanding Outward Bound content, Outward Bound's history, um, there was no way that Outward Bound wasn't going to find its way into this book. And there's a few other pieces that I'll talk about later, but one of them was the fact that Kurt Hahn had identified, through his writing in the 40s, 50s, and 60s, the declines um, of modern youth, the declines of modern youth. So, Will, you've got the trigger, right? Or
Yeah.
can I manage that?
I don't think so. Just tell me when to click.
Okay. So when Will and I were talking about what's going on with youth today, we were overwhelmed with things like statistics. So participation in Canada, and there's also um, a global survey on Healthy Kids Canada, and they have this international survey done every year. Mark Tremblay at the University of Ottawa is working on this. Um, there are national guidelines for physical activity, and the movement guidelines are not being met by most kids in most nations in the world. Like I think Canada usually gets anywhere between a C plus. I think there was a B minus a few years ago. People are familiar with this. So this is a criticism of kids these days. Go ahead, Will.
Hmm.
We also know, and again, we were talking about this before the webinar started, that we're using social media, smartphones, all sorts of devices, electronics, now AI, way too much. We're all distracted. But the narrative has been that kids are too distracted, and somehow, as adults, we're justifying our use of it because we're productive and we're paying the bills. But the reality is that we're all spending way too much time on these devices. Frontal lobes are being hijacked. We talked to a neurotherapist on this, Mary Swingle, author of iMinds, great book, really gives you the goods on what's going on with our minds when it comes to digital integration or digital interference. Um, Not cited in the anxious generation, interestingly. And then this third piece, Will, diagnoses. The rampant increase in therapeutic language, um, self-diagnosis, this constant recognition that there's mental health issues, and then the narrative of struggling kids, struggling mental health issues, and the rates at which kids are diagnosed and then put on medications or antidepressants in this case. Now, we use this a little bit tongue in cheek here in that this is what we have dubbed the kids these days effect. We'll speak more to it in a minute, but I just want to show you what Kurt Hahn said in the late 50s. There was a decline in fitness due to modern methods of locomotion, right? We all know this from the Outward Bound material. We know this, we repeat this. The youth of the day were too inactive and they weren't meeting the National Physical Health and Activity Movement guidelines of the day. Well, maybe they're still not. Next one. The decline in initiative and enterprise due to the widespread disease of spectatoritis. What is spectatoritis if it isn't staring and scrolling on a screen? And then the third one, again, these are Kurt Hahn's words. The decline of self-discipline due to the ever-present availability of stimulants and tranquilizers. And I know Will likes to make the joke when he presents on this that this is now actually evidence-based practice. This is what we do to young people. Self-diagnosis, diagnosis, medication. This is what we've referred to as the kids these days effect. It's this phenomenon of criticizing youth, pathologizing children and adolescents and where they're at. It's also this generational effect that anyone on this call, when you reach the age of 18 or 19 years, you could turn and look back and point to that next group and say, kids these days. It's classic, it's generational. We didn't realize that this is the nature of our society, and it's almost human nature to criticize kids as adults.
Hmm.
Underlying theme in the book. Go ahead, Will.
Yeah, and so it was funny. Kids these days was sort of just a title that Nevin came up with, and I started. Um, we were writing all this sort of mental health statistics and all these things, and I went, well, hold on a second. What does this kids these days thing? Where does this come from? And I started going back, and I actually found a study that showed that sort of the more intelligent someone thinks they are, like as a self-rating as an adult, like I'm a very smart person, the more likely they are to say kids don't read anymore. And that's generational, right? The more conservative someone's values are, not politically conservative, but like people need to respect their elders, the more likely they are to say, kids these days don't respect their elders. But what, and so I started tracing it back. And if you think social media bans are the thing of the day, Some of you were in here before we hit record. Like New York City banned pinball for 30 years from the 1940s because of this is going to make all the kids gambling addicts. Pinball, it looks like a slot machine. It jingles and jangles like a slot machine. This is a terrible thing. We freaked out about the kaleidoscope when it was invented in 1818. That was the fastest piece of technology of all time when it was invented in England. There was the Anxious Generation 1.0 was a book called The Seduction of the Innocent in the 1950s. This was a book about comic books. It had things like, Batman and Robin are secretly in a same-sex relationship and it's going to turn all your kids gay. Or Wonder Woman is a terrible influence for young women because they'll learn that they could be anything but a housewife. So usually what you find, and by the way, that led to comic book bans, burning parties where parents got together and burned comic books. So you can see, oh, am I back? Oh, so you can see um, how the narrative is often not really about the kids. It's often about the world that adults want to have. So we started chapter one with this quote that children now love luxury, they have bad manners, contempt for authority, and they show disrespect for elders. They love chatter in place of exercise. Now, this quote is from K.J. Freeman from an Oxford dissertation from 1907, I believe, Nevin. And the interesting thing about this quote is this quote is often attributed to Socrates. Socrates died in 399 BC. That's when we still counted the years in the wrong direction, right? We're counting down from 399 BC to zero, and now we're up to 2026. So this is how far we could get back to adults just whinging and complaining about kids. And when it also gets to technology, I'd like you to go back to one of my superheroes, Henry David Thoreau. And I went to boarding school in Massachusetts. And I know that Outward Bound Massachusetts School was important in Outward Bound in the corrections world. I think that was back in like the 80s. But look at this quote from Thoreau. How little do the most wonderful inventions of modern times detain us. They insult nature. Every machine or particular application seems a slight outrage against universal laws. So that was 1854, and technology was so bad in Concord, Massachusetts, that Thoreau had to run away to the woods 2 miles away from Concord, Massachusetts. So we have this adult part of the kids these days effect, and I hear this when we think about social media and kids. Modern times, terrible. Good old days, better. So I often hear, and I've heard this come out of Jonathan Haidt's mouth, that, kids in the 80s, school, there was no technology, like as if kids weren't doodling in class or bored out of their mind in class, like I was at school before phones. But also in the 1980s, there was a lot of bad things. That generation now, you know, um, that generation now takes their life more than any generation, more than the kids. I think in California, it was only 1987 that they banned corporal punishment for children. Like there was a lot of horrible things going on in those apparent good old days that we should be going back to. So Neva and I both write quite often from this perspective that the truth of the matter is you can't only live in the modern times that you're living in. A good perspective helps us to see what's really going on here. But we're also inundated with something that's happening that is drastically different. I mean, who has seen graphs like this on the TV, in the books we read? Like, look at the increase of anxiety from 2010 to 2018 for the ages 18 to 25. We're seeing this rise in the United States. Now, youth anxiety in the United States, it's easy to cherry pick the 2000s to start. There's a study that we talk about in the book that from the 1950s to the 1980s, the average youth anxiety in the 1980s would have warranted inpatient psychiatric care in the 1950s. This is before the smartphone. This is before, everyone's just starting to get a television, kind of. There is something going on before this. But then we see the headlines and the narrative. And again, I want you to stick with positive deviance and this idea of a global youth mental health crisis. Because what matters here is who is doing the counting. Why is this narrative important? So if we put on sort of in our philosophical terms, our really classic feminist philosophical orientation, who wants this dominant narrative to sell? Who needs there to be a youth mental health crisis? And Nevin, you'll add a bit to this.
Yeah, and I was just thinking that maybe we could, it's not necessarily a thought experiment, but just to get people thinking about how, back to my example of social emotional learning, how younger kids today, so children and youth, are learning the language of therapy. It's a society that has become therapized. We all understand and know the names of diagnoses for different types of behaviors. If anybody had a copy of the Diagnostic Statistics Manual, the DSM, the Psychiatrist Bible, where all the diagnoses live, you would be able to self-diagnose yourself. And this is what we're seeing as a trend, is that children and youth learning the language of diagnoses, of disorder, of ill mental health. We even found a book called Psychiatry for Kids. It was a children's cartoon book teaching kids, like, this is what obsessive compulsive disorder is. This is what anxiety is. Why are we teaching kids this? So, anyways, that language is there. Then someone goes online, you've got social media, you've got WebMD. Just type in any symptoms that you're having, you're going to find yourself aligned with a few diagnoses. If you end up in a medical doctor's office or a psychiatrist or a school counselor using that language, the likelihood of you moving towards someone who can provide you with a diagnosis is really high. The likelihood is that they're also going to use one of two measures: a general anxiety disorder measure or a patient health questionnaire. These are the two measures that were designed to help doctors to diagnose depression and anxiety. Those two measures, we review them critically in the book. We talk about where they came from, how likely, if that measure is pulled out, that you're going to leave the office with a diagnosis, a low, moderate, or severe or significant depression or anxiety, which has an associated amount of pharmacological treatment that goes along with that. And when you shine light in the corners, you find that the same two diagnostic tools were developed by the same researchers, funded by the same marketing department of the pharmaceutical companies that produce depression and anxiety medication. This is, again, part of our book, and part of the exploration that we went through is that we've often found there's uncooperative systems pushing some of these bad ideas, supporting some of these practices, because there's someone benefiting from it. There's a corporate angle to it.
And I was having a conversation with a colleague about this yesterday. Let's also look at this from the Western perspective. Like in the United States, if you want your health insurance to pay for the therapy you receive, you need a diagnosis. So, one thing, there's some really good things that are happening. Teen pregnancy, down. Teen, uh, teen smoking, down. Teens
Drinking.
don't drink as much, down. There's also a problem of our teens participating in life, down as well sometimes. But the thing is, more people go to therapy than ever before. And if more people go to therapy, you have more diagnosis. This is how the system is structured. I started um, an outpatient adventure therapy program in Maryland in 2005. And I used to have to call health insurance companies and they'd say, "What's the diagnosis?" And we'd have to say ADHD or something. So you see the rise, even though that's the system the mental health world is playing in. But I want you to take this word global for a second, right? It's a global crisis. And then I'm going to show you some deceiving graphs. And I know that all of us would prefer pictures of trees because we're outdoor people, but we're just going to look at some graphs for a second. This is graphs of global suicide rates from 1990 to 2020. So if you just look at the European Union, the bottom line here, this is for females, and this line is for males, going down. So what's the global crisis here in the European Union? Um, and then you look at, but if you look at North America, again, you have it very high in the 90s, went down, and something did happen that it went back up. It's easy to attribute that to the modern times, but it's also important that we don't look at the way we're intervening with kids. Could it be something different? Because the truth of the matter is, um, all of these places have smartphones and social media and the internet and 24-hour news and all the things that and schools. And so there's something different happening that could really be cultural, much more cultural. And now I'm kicking myself about this graph because I only used data here up to 2012. The rates, so we found data in England, the highest rates of increased antipsychotic use, that's serious medications, is for preschoolers. That's the age group that's having the largest increase of being prescribed medications. When we know that no person without a fully developed brain should ever even be diagnosed with a personality disorder, we're seeing increased rates of borderline personality disorder diagnoses. Um, and even though borderline personality disorder does not, the research is pretty clear that really, besides prescribing stimulants, antidepressants are actually very harmful to someone with that diagnosis, yet that is the standard of care. I think the data we found was 90% of people with a borderline personality disorder diagnosis, and we question the whole diagnostic criteria anyway. You can't do a biopsy for any of these things. Um, Most of them are prescribed antidepressants, and that prescription with that diagnosis is one of the biggest predictors of future suicide in that cohort of people. So we have some big time narrative problems here. We also can see, so we have the rates of prescribing are going up. In Australia, where I am, we can find stimulant medication in the fish that we eat, in water runoff. That's the same with antidepressants. Now, this is interesting. This is rates of prescribing by country. And so then if we zoom out, again, don't just live in the times we're living in, but also not just live in the place that we're living in. Think globally here. Why is the rate of prescribing in Norway less than Sweden? Why is Australia more than New Zealand? Right? So it could be access to medical care, right? But if you look at Spain and Portugal, one of the interesting things here is Portugal spends about really in the average, like of if you put the most spending on mental health care to the least, Portugal's in the average with the highest rate of prescribing in the world per 100,000 people. That's a cultural difference. There's not something more wrong with people in these countries. We wouldn't be able to find that um, biologically. So one of the narratives that Nevin and I really wrestled with here is Is there actually a youth mental health crisis, or is this kind of a we really pathologize and label kids more than ever before? We were talking before we hit record about the anxious generation, right? Now, the data suggests that 4 out of 5 young people do not have a mental health problem. So, can we really say the whole generation is anxious if that's just simply not true? It doesn't add up. That in other parts of the world, um, looking at suicide rates, probably the best. It's probably one of the best data predictors we have with how sort of difficult it is to trust the measures that we're using. Um, it's sort of like a smoke detector predicting a fire after you burnt your toast. It's going off, but is there really a fire there? But at the same time, that doesn't mean young people aren't struggling. But what Nevin and I found, and what we're going to talk about for the rest of this talk, is that believing that the kids are more fragile, more coddled, more, we call them the killer D's, more disabled, diagnosed, disordered, deficient, deficits. If you believe these things, the way we intervene is almost always turning the screws onto the kids, right? It's almost always, and I interviewed a young person who said this to me a few years ago, and they said, every time I got stuck in a new therapist office, I knew how much adults didn't love me. So our intervening is sometimes not really working with what works. And what we know works is a lot of things that Outward Bound already has ingrained into the curriculum's a naughty word, but whatever we call it, I don't know. Um, but so but there are also some things changing in the world that we can really look at to go, maybe it's a lot of things over time that's making this a much more difficult world for youth to participate in.
Yeah. And some of those things are creating what Michael Unger called developmental fractures. And that's actually the reason why the word kids on the cover of our book has those tiny little fracture lines in it, is that it's playing on this idea that there have been changes over time that are creating a different world for our kids to grow up in. And one of those that we covered um, is in this chapter that we called Extinction of Experience. And this graph or map here is showing a 4 generations of a family. These studies have been done mostly in European cities where they've got multiple generations that have lived in the same areas. And what it's doing is it's showing how much independent mobility, or what they call ranging, children had when they were younger. I think this was around 8. They looked at 8 years of age. So the eldest in this study was the great grandfather, and that's in the centered bottom here. And the great grandfather George, when he was 8 years old, which was back in 1919, he was allowed to travel in that largest triangular shape there. So about 6 miles from his home. He was allowed to travel independently 6 miles to go fishing down in the Rother Valley there. The grandfather Jack, which would have been George's son in 1950 when he was 8, was allowed to travel in that circle in the top of the left of the triangle. So that's about a 1 mile radius of independent mobility. Then it goes to his son when he was 8. Oh, sorry, no, up to the mother, which was Jack's daughter when she was 8 in 1979, up in the top circle there in Chapeltown. She was allowed at 8 years of age to walk to the swimming pool alone a half mile away. You can see the story here. This is slowly reducing independent mobility and the ability for someone to range. Um, the last is the son, now 8. I think this is a few years back, but essentially is only allowed to walk on his own to the end of the street, which is about 300 yards. A lot of these studies were early 2000s. I would say now the majority of kids at 8 years of age are still having organized, structured play dates probably in family backyards, which are probably fenced, and I'm assuming the parents are probably nearby or present supervising them in that space. This is just one example of what is actually happening. And generally, generationally, we kind of forget these things. There's a generational amnesia that occurs as generations go by. If you talk to someone from two generations past, they talk about how many trees were in this neighborhood or how many fish were available in this lake. We don't see what multiple generations before see in terms of change. An extinction of experience that we heard about from one of our experts was um, Dr. Sandcedar, Alan Sandcedar from Norway, who's like the outdoor risky play specialist in the world, foremost specialist. She was saying that rough and tumble play, which is one form of risky play, has been so removed from early years education, kindercare, um, daycare, because it's seen as aggression or violence. But what it's done is it's removed an opportunity for the development of fundamental movement skills, all sorts of learning around consent and control. Like, how do I remain friends with Will while he and I are wrestling and trying to slam each other into the floor? The kids are the best at determining when it moves from friendly play to aggression, and they're actually better at learning to control that rather than having adults put blanket policies on them saying no roughhousing, no physical activity on the playgrounds, no running, so on and so forth. And one thing, Will, I know you usually mention when you talk about the statistics, and we've mentioned this in the book, is that currently, at least in North America, the youngest child in any classroom is the most likely to be diagnosed with ADHD, simply suggesting that the type of behavior is pathologized and then medicated for control, behavioral control in the classroom, which Will understands well. He grew up in this generation. I understood well because of the strap and corporal punishment and actually being in fear, living in fear of teachers.
And Ian, the comment Ian brought up in the chat about individual learning plans. Like I teach at the largest school of social work in Australia. So there are times I'm in a lecture theater with 350 people. And one of the things is about we see the rising rates of the individual education plans. But if I actually tried to make any structural change to the university and our style of teaching, I would be like they'd say, no, you can't change that. So there's almost at times a tokenistic sort of way that the diagnosis maintains the status quo of, let's say, the schooling system, of the lack of ranging that's happening. It kind of it it protects us from the deviation in some way. But what we want to talk about here, and I'm going to pass back to Nevin, is sort of some of the ideas that Kurt Hahn did propose, right? He had the declines of modern youth from the 30s, right? The kids they're getting lazy because of advanced locomotion. People just got over having horses. The fast car went like 40 miles an hour then. But he did propose some things that were really important to us.
Yeah, and that's again for those who are a part of Outward Bound, you understand and know this well that um, Kurt Hahn's movements were um, from a democratic approach, from democratic education. He was involved in numerous projects outside of Outward Bound that were doing the same thing. Like, let's look for the strengths, let's build community, let's build individual capacity for service to greater community. Um, he understood that youth needed to challenge themselves, like the idea of pushing and testing oneself against how one did yesterday. There's more in you than you think, all those adages, right? Um, One of our interviewees that we spoke to was Dr. Martin Brokenleg. For those who from the 1990s, if you were involved in social service or youth work or youth treatment, you would be familiar with the book Reclaiming Children at Risk by Martin Brokenleg and his colleagues. And they created, or at least articulated, this model, which is the circle of courage. Again, not our material. but many might be quite familiar with it. We found that it is very, very closely tied to Outward Bound's adage that youth are crew and not passengers. In fact, there were so many parallels to it, and some of the research literature that we were finding supported this model that we had to include the model in the book. Um, Again, Martin Brokenleg and his colleagues looked at indigenous child rearing practices and then developed this model, published it, and many of the outdoor programs, at least I worked with in Canada, we adopted this because it made so much sense. This four, stages where kids need to feel like they belong. They need to feel like they're, again, passenger or crew and not passengers. They have to have a sense of security in some base relationship where they can then take some challenges, take some chances to develop skills, which again, Outward Bound is right on track with this. That sense of mastery comes from feeling like I'm okay at this, or maybe even I'm good at this. Sense of mastery is one of the greatest catalysts for all the selves, self-development, self-esteem, self-worth, um, which then leads to the possibility of someone becoming more individuated from family and community. And that's the third stage of the circle of courage, which is independence. If we do our job as the adults and the parents and the youth workers and the outdoor guides in creating belonging, relational work, allowing for mastery, which is that independence and autonomy that can come from practicing and trying new things and growing and developing, then we will see the fourth quadrant, which is generosity, where the individual then has got to the point where they can give back. They give back to, in service of, in their intimate relationships, in their families, in their communities, and then for society as a whole. Um, and again, Martin Broken Leg, very close to the end of his career, super supportive, and has always been a big fan of outdoor adventure work for youth development, for reclaiming the sort of sense of self in kids that are broken. And one thing he told us in our book, and it was quite impactful in the way that we set up conversations around even the starving sense of um, he said that youth are starving today, starving for emotionality, starving for spirituality. And that's part of the reason he believes that kids then are gorging on things like social media. They're seeking some type of meaning from it and relationship from it. And so starving and gorging become two of the chapters in our book based on Martin Brokenleg's work.
Mhm. Yeah. And I think one of the things, and I think we can take some questions now with the 10 minutes that we have to go, that one of the things Nev and I, we wrote a paper with a group of colleagues actually right when we left that conference in Norway in 2022. And we wrote it about really revisiting success and mastery. Now, when I was doing my doctoral research, the Walsh and Gollins, what's it, the process model for Outward
Yeah.
Bound from the 70s, that actually was really interesting to me because I had read it in my wilderness therapy days back in the US. But when I started to try and understand what's going on when we take people in the outdoors, I could go back, I think it was the 1930s we wrote about this in that paper and in the book, that um, there was one of the first like adolescent psychiatry conferences in the United States in the 30s. Um, the proceedings of that conference were like the most effective way to treat adolescent. I think they called it psychopathology back then, was to medicate them all. No, I'm just kidding. They did not say that at all. They said success and mastery. We need to facilitate experiences where people have success and mastery. And Sarah's question of is Outward Bound a great example of positive deviance? Like, first, I think Kurt Hahn is 100% an example of positive deviance. I mean, getting exiled from Germany is very impressive. At the same time, there are times, and I see this, and I'm not an outward bound, like I'm not speaking. I don't want to generalize, but I see this in outdoor practice generally. There are times when we get too focused on we get too process oriented. We have to get to this place at this time. We have to teach this skill on this day. We have to get everybody rock climbing or else. And what happens is we lose the wild card, the person who's making Outward Bound meaningful is the student. They're the meaning making machine. So things like Nevin and I have written about this previously, when we say things like, let's do a trust fall activity. Well, why? You've already said what the person has to learn. Trust, right? You can just say you should trust people. So instead of loosening the curriculum and then allowing people to make the meaning themselves, where if a young person says, no, I'm not doing that, didn't they just like not consent to something? And we can see how you could actually go, what was it like to say no to an adult? What was that experience like for you? You can really make meaning out of anything. So I think that the circle of courage model is probably the closest we got to telling people what to do, the closest to a parenting book that we wrote. But no, what a treat to be here. And with a few minutes left, if there are questions, and I'm happy to stay an extra few minutes. It's only 7:25 a.m., so my workday hasn't even started yet. So if there's questions, please feel free to ask anything or push back or challenge, and that would be great.
Will, do we want people to put questions in the chat, in the
Yeah, I think so.
Q&A?
I think the
Okay, just
chat's
put
the
them in the
best place.
chat.
I've got it open now that Nevin revitalized the chat from Invisible World.
Okay,
Yeah.
great.
Yeah,
So
either.
folks, there's a message right now. There's a, Jake, is that a question or do you want to pose that to everyone?
Well, I really like Jake's question
Okay, you do.
about triumph and defeat. But struggle and failing, like I wrote this. This is a old for any psychotherapy nerds out there. Milton Erickson was really he's kind of in too much guru world now, but he was this hypnotherapist and psychiatrist from the mid 1900s, and he was a very good storyteller. And so Nevin and I took this story for the start of the book that sometimes we can think of like success and defeat as these polar opposites of something. Um, but the way Milton Erickson told this story, I love it, and I always tell the story to parents that of the kids that I'm young people that I'm working with, that there is nothing you have failed more at than learning how to walk. Nothing. And the adults could not help you get better at failing at learning to walk. The only thing they could do is make sure the stairs were blocked off and make sure sharp corners and the sockets were closed. So every time you fell over while learning to walk, nobody called that a defeat or a failure. It was part of your developmental process. So sometimes when we think of this as kids need to struggle more, no, they are struggling. We need to give them more space and stop interfering and intervening as much with what's going on. So I think the way you can do this, explaining that approach to parents and teachers, is we've become so risk averse in our classroom. I mean, where I come from in Maryland, my public school system has banned tag, football, baseball, no two kids on the monkey bars. A school in Queensland, Australia, 10 years ago banned cartwheels and headstands to protect the kids, right? So who's that really protecting? It's protecting the adults from dealing with their own anxiety of letting your child learn how to walk, to learn how to play, to learn how to interact with other people. So often, and I come from Washington, D.C., so I'll just use this example, not that my country is politically in a really fantastic place, but you think about politics, and I'll go home and I'll sit with my mother, who's amazing, and she loves politics, right? And she'll be watching the news. And I'm sitting there and they're going, this country is so divided, nobody talks to me. And you flip to the political other side's news, and they're like, this country is so divided. And I go, why don't you all turn this shit off and go talk to your neighbor? And then we don't have to worry about what these talking heads are saying all the time. And we can build community again where kids can play together and be together and range safely. But that starts with adults dealing with their own anxiety. And
Yeah.
Caroline brings up a good point. Kids can't even walk to elementary school, and we're wondering why they're anxious about asking someone out on a date. They haven't played house anymore. So imagine not playing house as a child and then being 14, having wild hormones and figuring out how to play house.
I'd like to jump in, Will, and just add to Jake's comment. At least for outdoor programming, and Will and I again have taken our work into a slightly different lane. When we're working in a therapeutic realm, the notion of risk and challenge has to be thought about more critically because a lot of the young people we're working with are already living in significant amounts of risk and challenge on a daily basis. And this notion that we have to provide risk and challenge for them to learn and grow is a false assumption. We need to work in building relationships to understand what types of risk and challenge they may want to endure to grow and develop from. Does that make sense? Like it's not just a given that risk is a part of growth and learning because it depends where a person is at. Just to add to that point, Will, to Ian's question,
Yeah.
asking about have you had the opportunity to share your book with young people? Well, yes, our now very young adult kids know way too much about this book. And I don't know, at least on my end, they were consultants on every chapter, but we had talked about doing the exact same thing we did with the experts, which was including a dozen or two interviews with youth that had some perspective that would add to the book. I found on my end at the university that it becomes a royal pain in the ass to get permissions to do it under the ethical supervision for research purposes. And the freedom of writing a book like this is that we didn't have to participate in that system. Will and I have had that on the books as the follow up. So your question, Ian, is absolutely 100% bang on that we believed that youth of the day would probably have something similar to say that there's far too much intervention, far too much interference, and that some of the ideas aren't working for them, especially the safety culture piece. It's outrageous to think that there's a developmental fracture in someone's ability to go on a date because they didn't play house enough as a kid or
Mm.
Yeah.
have unsupervised playtime with experimentation.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And I want to get to Sarah's also asked a question about a similar thing. How have young people responded? And then back to Ian's question about youth in sort of leadership positions, right? There was and one of the things Nevin wrote about is youth voice has been really front and center to our entire research career. Both of our PhDs were about relational work with young people, working with families and with young people in the outdoors. And so youth voice is missing. I also want to put this in another perspective to this. Like we're seeing like in the therapy world, like cognitive behavioral therapy. I call it the cognitive behavioral tsunami after this book I read like 10 years ago about this. So this therapy is like the most funded, most looked at. It's perfectly fine. There's nothing wrong with it, but it's just as bad or good as everything else. But the thing with this is cognitive behavioral therapy was never created for children. So none of these concepts were developed with kids, for kids. To put this in a broader perspective, if you look at like Ritalin, Ritalin was developed by I think he was a Polish chemist in the 50s or something. And he was playing around with synthesized methylphenidate. And his wife, Marguerite, was getting a little bit too overweight for his liking, and she wasn't paying attention. So he tested this drug on his wife, Marguerite, and it worked. So he called it the Ritalin. This was not developed to help kids sit still in classrooms. Adderall was a weight loss drug called Obliterol. It was bought by another pharmaceutical company. They hired a marketing team. What should we call this so we can test it on kids? ADD for all, Adderall. So these kind of ideas don't come from a place of talking to the kids. So Nevin and I, we were really upfront in the introduction that yes, a really good criticism of our book is where is the youth voice? But we also were very clear with this book is not the time for that. This is the time to talk to adults about this. And then hopefully they can go and talk to the kids and do the relational work. Because the second we all tell you how to build a relationship with someone, all we've done is given you 4 new steps that will fail tomorrow.
Great.
I'm not seeing any other
There's
questions.
a question from Joelle asking about types of risk.
Hmm.
Yeah, I wrote something in there. I think if you're thinking about risk, you can get really nuanced about it with educators or facilitators or even working in a corporate environment when you start talking about what does social risk look like? What does emotional risk look like? What does spiritual risk like? You can get them thinking more deeply about um, what it is that risk actually is intending to do. um, Experiential education models, when people are taught them, they're often taught in a way that risk is just something that we just accept, right? That it's a part of the process. Risk is needed. Risk is necessary for growth. Is risk necessary for growth if you're working with someone that's coming from a home full of abuse and alcoholism? Is the student coming out on an outward bound program um, got all those developmental blocks in place without developmental fractures? Like they're going to be in a different place than the young person who shows up. Looks the same on the surface, but within building your relationship, you realize full of developmental fractures, difficulty with communication, difficulty with speaking up, um, trying hard to please people because they're accustomed to being abused and like whatever. It's got to be relational so that they feel that they belong and go back to the circle of courage model. I don't know if that's up for everybody on the webinar screen still, but it was a good slide to end on. Um, and for those interested in that, actually, there's a training that Martin and his colleagues run, the original founders of the Circle of Courage, and these guys are end of career. These guys are mid to late 80s now. They're running a training in North Dakota, South Dakota, North Dakota, South Dakota, wherever the Circle of Courage training program is happening. And Martin is flying down for his last training. He's also dealing with ALS. I'm going to try my hardest to get the money together to go down and do that last reclaiming children and youth training with those elders, because I think it's not going to happen again, unfortunately. But the book's still there.
Okay.
That's
Um,
all.
is there any kind of final words you wanted to say, or are we ready to wrap up?
I'm words.
Final words. Well, I
Yeah,
think
I don't
just
know.
going back to positive deviance is we critiqued a lot of systems here that in place and a lot of the dominant narrative about things. And that sometimes can be finger wagging and um, it can be I know better than everybody else. But one of the other things, and I saw this in a someone shared this study with me out of Australian outdoor education study, where they interviewed all these people um, who had run outdoor ed programs. And one of them said, We knew the kids behaved better when they were in the outdoors with us. We knew they were more engaged when they were in the outdoors with us. And then it was a huge shock when funding got tight that we were the first thing to go from the school. So, how good were we really? How much did the other people care? So, part of positive deviance is also sharing everything, sharing that we are also part of a system that we need to share our knowledge and learn the knowledge from other people. Like I've said this before when interviewed that I don't think kids these days would have had the what I think I feel really proud of in speaking for Nevin, if we didn't do this together, that it was two people wrestling with ideas. And like we agree on a lot of things, but then we were like, is that too harsh? Is this too mean? Are we being too soft on something? And so part of that when it comes to deviance is also doing that deviating in community with colleagues, and unfortunately, sometimes trying to influence the uncooperative systems that we all live in. So
Mhm.
I think we can know the answer, but it's also how do we communicate that answer? How do we share that with a wider range of people that I think that's sort of the thing that like Outward Bound has such an amazing history that I think that really trying to translate that to how can a teacher in a classroom take these ideas and implement
Mhm.
them in their boring pre-calculus class that everybody falls asleep in.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I would like to, maybe it's a closing comment, but I'd also like to address Stephanie's comment about letting her daughters learn from mistakes. I think it's important, and we write about this in the book, that we have to be or consider ourselves lighthouses. So we have to put up the guardrails, right? So we have to have the structure for kids to actually go out and have experiences and potentially learn from mistakes and have their challenges. But at the same time, know that the lighthouse is there, and putting that light out into the foggy land of development as an adolescent, and know that it's safe harbors. It's a safe place back, and that the relationship is strong enough that you can take the risks knowing that the safety, or it's safe enough with you and your relationship as a parent. Um, there was another comment, Kendra's, about skiing and development. This is showing up at the highest levels in high performance sport, Kendra, this notion that physical literacy is a fracture. There are kids getting up through sport into high school, into high performance sport, heading towards Olympic qualifying level, that don't have particular things, whether it's flexibility or um, certain types of strength training. Like, kids haven't been playing and growing up in a physical world strong enough to be able to do things. So yeah, if you take a group of school kids out and you're trying to teach them skiing the way that we taught skiing 20 years ago, you're going to be sorely disappointed. They may physically be at a completely different place because of their lack of experience. We've had colleagues say that kids from some cities in Europe, some inner city kids getting out into nature, into wildlands, traveling in by bus, getting out of a vehicle and never seeing a starlit sky, will actually have an experience of putting their hands up to protect themselves because there's something unfamiliar happening, and it's just the starlight above them. They've never seen it before. I have a grad student right now who says kids in Sao Paulo in Brazil, if they grow up in the apartment blocks, they know what concrete feels like under their feet, and they know what sand feels like. But you take them out to do outdoors stuff out in El Campesino, and they can't stand walking barefoot on grass because they've never had this experience. These are teenagers, and they're freaking out by walking on grass. So we don't have as unstructured and free, random, outdoor, risky play that we had as kids, and we can harken back and we can be all nostalgic about that, but we have to also try to create systems to ensure that they're getting those experiences. There's lots of questions rolling in now, Sarah.
Well, I know we
That's
have to
good.
wrap up, but I also say that Nevin and I, we are we can be a bit of an open book. So there are ways, and we'll share the slide deck with everyone in the recording. But Jade asks how you share things. Nevin and I are both on Substack, which is it's kind of like social media and not totally annoying. And so we write different things there, and we I encourage everybody that wants to share things to go write it down. Like don't
Hmm.
wait for you know, like we have all these myths, like I could never write a peer-reviewed article without a PhD. Like, no, you could if you wanted to. No one will read it anyway, but go and share everything and write what you want to and put your message out there. And then also, I think so. I'm on all the social medias. Nevin's on LinkedIn and on Substack, so we're pretty easy to find. And I'm pretty open to stay in touch, especially if you work at Outward Bound Croatia. Um, um, but um, I also say
Royal
that
Sweet.
another big thing to do is be somebody else's first follower. That if you see someone who you go, that's freaking cool, go amplify their work too, and then we can make everything so much louder.
Hmm.
Mm.
Yeah.
100%.
I think Josephine's going to wrap us up, but there's a question. Is there an Outward Bound in South Africa? Yes, there is. So, one thing I would say is if you want to know a bit more about Outward Bound, go to the Outward Bound International website. You can link to all of the Outward Bound schools. There's 36 of them, and go right to their websites from the international website. All right, Josephine, over to you.
Thank you, everyone. Just as we wrap up today's webinar, I really wanted to extend a huge thank you both to you, Will, and Nevin, for sharing your insights and the important work that went in to create Kids These Days. So I'm Josephine Barra, and I'm the Executive Director with Outward Bound Canada. And for me, like I deeply appreciated that this book challenged many of the assumptions. I'm almost also like a parent of three. And it really challenged kind of some of those assumptions you have about young people, and that it's not more pressure, more structure, more labels that are needed. It's really that unstructured play. It's that exploratory opportunities and that tolerance of discomfort. And in Outward Bound Canada,
Hmm.
these themes are deeply connected to our mission and the daily work that we do. We see firsthand the transformative impact that time in nature and authentic experience can have on young people. So whether it's building confidence, strengthening resilience, or fostering a deeper, connection to self, I think the conversations we've had today strongly affirm, why the work that we're all doing really matters. So I'm incredibly grateful to everyone that joined us today and contributed to this important dialogue, whether it's, our presenters are in the chat, leaving the questions. And I hope it leaves you inspired to continue rethinking how we support young people and advocate for experiences that help them thrive. So thanks again, Will and Nevin, and I hope we stay in touch.
Thank you for having us.
Thanks so much.